Today I'm talking about 3 common mistakes I see landscape photographers make in the field. Have you ever found yourself coming home from a landscape photography outing or a landscape photography trip and copying the files from your camera to your computer and being, what is this? If so, this is the video for you. I used to feel the exact same thing back when I first came back to landscape photography. I would get my camera, I'd go out to some cool location, but I never felt confident that I was getting the image that I wanted to get from a technical perspective. I always had a little bit of doubt and uncertainty, and I would do these safety shots and extra shots, and I'd try all sorts of different things just to make sure I came home with at least one good image. Now, as I've gained more experience, I've learned much more about my camera settings, I've been out much more, and I have confidence in my technical ability to capture the image I want to capture. Now, whether my composition is great or something like that, that's always something I'm working on. But my technical foundation I feel is pretty strong, and I feel pretty confident that when I go out to a scene, I can properly expose it, get the focus I want, and come home with a pretty clean image to work with in Lightroom. And I've moved into helping other people improve their landscape photography either through this YouTube channel and the videos I put out here or through landscape photography workshops. I've found 3 common mistakes I think people make that affect this confidence in the field and make you feel a little uncertain. Now, I've actually talked about a lot of these problems on my channel before, but I've come to realize that people might not know what to search for or what to look for. All they know is they go out, pick up their camera, and they're not comfortable, but they don't know how to translate that discomfort or that uncertainty into what skill they need to look at. And that's where this video comes in. We're going to talk about those 3 common mistakes I see and how to fix them. Okay, the first common mistake I often see people make, and I was guilty of this too, is trusting the LCD on the back of the camera too much for your exposure. It really isn't the greatest tool. Here's what would happen to me when I first came back to landscape photography. I would go out, I would get my camera all set up, and I would take pictures, and I would use the camera light meter, and I would use it to sort of get a gauge for what I thought was a proper exposure, but I'd rely so heavily on how it looked on the back of the camera as far as how bright it was and things like that to gauge it. And what would happen is it looked good on the back of the camera. I'd be in these dark waterfall scenes, the water would look good, the caves would look good, and I'd bring them home and I'd bring them into Lightroom and everything was underexposed. What's going on is your display brightness impacts what it looks like. So if you have your display brightness set to either what it is by default or you've bumped it up a little bit so maybe you could see it in the sun, but then you go someplace where it's a little darker, you could be capturing underexposed images and the brightness of the display is making them look better than they really are. So when you get them home on your computer, everything looks underexposed. And in your left, you're going to be bringing exposure sliders up and shadows up, and you're going to be introducing a little bit of noise to your images. So it's just one of those things. It really pays to learn how to take a proper exposure and not rely on that screen brightness. Now you might say, well, why don't you just crank that display brightness down and you'll be all set. That way it's not too bright and it's a good representation. But depending on the light situation going from place to place, one, if it's not bright enough, if you're trying to photograph on a sunny day, you may not be able to see the display. And it's still just not a great thing. It could differ from one camera to the other or something like that. And for me, one of the first ways I tried to correct this was to just exposure bracket everything. I would go out and I would take a picture of what really wasn't a high dynamic scene, but because I lacked confidence, I would exposure bracket everything and figure, oh, one of them will be okay. And that's really just not a great way to do it either, because then you come home with way too many files when you really didn't need to bring that many files home. It's better to feel confident about capturing it. And this is probably one of the most significant things that changed in my technical fundamentals, my technical understanding of landscape photography and being confident in my skills get exposure is enable the histogram. Use the histogram. On the mirrorless cameras, we can have the histogram available in live view. And the histogram, what it is it's a representation of the tones in your image. So it shows on a little graph, and tones to the left are the darker side. Tones to the right are on the highlight side, and everything in the middle is those midtones. And if you use that to set your exposure, so you watch where it's going, and you can still change your shutter speed, you can change your aperture, you can use your ISO, any of the normal exposure triangle things to influence what that histogram looks like, but it is an accurate representation of the scene. You don't have to worry about the screen brightness impacting it. You just have to watch that graph. That is the single biggest thing that changed my confidence in getting a good exposure, was enabling the histogram and referencing it. Even if you you can't enable in live view, or you just really like the viewfinder and you can't get it enabled in the viewfinder, you can use it in playback mode. I used to do that in some of my DSLRs. As I would take my picture and I would look at it in playback mode, and you could almost always get the histogram to show there. I'd take a look, make some adjustments, re-review the image. But the point being, it gave me a tool that showed the tonal representation of the scene more accurately than having to rely on the LCD screen brightness. Now, I've done a full video on the histogram because, like I said, I am a big fan of it, and I will link to it down in the description below. But I highly recommend, if you want to feel more confident in your exposures, don't rely on the back of the LCD. I don't even really recommend using the camera light meter very often to people, though you can use it as long as you understand what it's doing. Once you learn how to use the histogram properly, I can practically guarantee your confidence in being able to properly expose an image is going to increase significantly, and you'll be much more comfortable in the field and be able to focus on the creative side of things instead of worrying about, did you get the proper exposure? The next mistake I see happening a lot is setting your aperture to something too small. I did this one as well. As landscape photographers, we learn about wanting acceptable sharpness from front to back of the image, and the way to do that is through your depth of field, which is controlled by the aperture, and a smaller aperture gets you a deeper depth of field. A lot of us in the beginning, we stop listening there, and it's like, cool, I'll just crank my aperture up, and I'll have sharpness from the front to the back of my image, and it'll all work out great. I did this when I came back to landscape photography. I was like, okay, smaller aperture, better depth of field. That's what I want. I want a big depth of field. So I would go out f16. It was like the minimum I would shoot. f22 was not unheard of. And that's what I did. But then you'd bring those images back home and you'd be like, they're still a little soft. Why is that? And it's because of a thing called diffraction. So what happens is when you set your aperture really small, it makes that opening in the lens very small. So the light comes through and it bounces and it diffracts through there. That diffraction causes a softness in your image. So while you're getting a big depth of field, because the light is bouncing through this really small hole in the diaphragm of the lens, it softens the image. So the reality is, once you learn about diffraction and you realize, oh, I can't just go up to f22 because then that introduces diffraction. You've got to find the right balance between a deep depth of field and not too much diffraction. So different lenses have different sweet spots, but as a general rule of thumb, at least the one I follow, is I typically aim for around f8 if I'm looking to get a decent sized depth of field. I'll kick up to f11 in cases. If I need to, I'll go to f16. A lot of cases you'll start to get a little bit of diffraction, but I don't think it's detracting or anything to worry about. F22 are pretty much reserved just for sort of sun stars and things like that these days. Otherwise, I'm aiming for that f8, f11. Now, if you really want to figure it out for your lens, you probably want to take your lens, set them up in the backyard, and work through a series to figure out what aperture is exactly the best for your lens. But as a general rule of thumb, if you don't want to take the time to go out and do that, get into that f8, f11, and you're probably going to be looking pretty good for your lens of finding that sweet spot between depth of field so you can acceptably sharp image without introducing a lot of diffraction that's going to cause softening that you didn't want to get in what was supposed to be a sharp image. And the third common mistake I see a lot of people making is around ISO. And this one actually goes one of two ways. I either see people that have heard that you want the lowest ISO possible for the situation, so they set their ISO to ISO 100 and refuse to move it. They feel like there's no situation that should ever move it because they've been told you want to shoot the lowest ISO possible for the scene, and they interpret that to mean you should always be shooting at ISO 100. The other version of this I see is people that don't really pay much attention to their ISO at all accidentally end up with it set to say like ISO 3200, even though on a relatively bright day, and then they sort of adjust their shutter speed and their aperture around it, and they come away with images that are okay exposed, but they've lost out on the dynamic range of having a lower ISO, as well as they're starting to get extra noise in their image they wouldn't have had if they'd shot with a lower ISO. So the important thing is here, like I said, the ISO issues I see sort of go one of two ways, is just be aware of ISO and what it does and when you should change it. So the rule of thumb that you hear is true. You want the lowest ISO that's appropriate for the scene. Why is that? Well, if you're down at like ISO 100 or ISO 64, you're typically going to get your better dynamic range and you're not going to get as much noise in the photo. Now, modern cameras have things like ISO invariance and things like that that factor into this, but to keep it simple, that's why you want a low ISO, is you get cleaner files and you get better dynamic range out of them. But keep in mind, what did I say? You want the lowest ISO appropriate for the situation. So that means if you're on a tripod and you can have your shutter open for a longer period of time, then a low ISO works because you can set it to ISO 100. Say you're photographing a waterfall and some lower light, you're down in this little creek valley or this little, gorge or something like that. So you don't have a ton of light, you get the water. Because you're on a tripod, you can have a slower shutter speed and it all works out. But what if there's a wind blowing through and it's moving leaves? Well, you need to get that shutter speed up. And if your ISO is super low, you're going to be having to use a longer shutter speed, which means you're going to see movement of those leaves. Or maybe that water moving through the scene is turning too milky white. You want some texture in it. You don't want it to be completely milky white. And in order to do that, you're going to need to speed your shutter up. And if you refuse to move your ISO from ISO 100 because you've been told it should always be the lowest it should be, you're going to miss these other nuances of being able to adjust those other settings to get the creative image that you want. So what you can do is you can bump your ISO up maybe to ISO 400, and then you can speed that shutter speed up a little bit, and maybe it'll be enough to stop that tree from moving because you'll be able to freeze that movement. Or maybe you'll be able to get that texture back in your water. So there are times it is appropriate to bump that ISO up. Another time is if you're not on a tripod and you're shooting handheld. We've talked about my coffee shake hands all the time. And I know I sort of by default, as soon as I start doing handheld photography, unless it's a bright sunny day or I'm out, on some vista in the middle of the day, I will almost by default go to ISO 400 because it lets me bump that shutter speed up just a little bit more to freeze any kind of movement that I want to freeze. And it helps compensate for any kind of camera shake I might get by doing it handheld. So, yes, low ISO is good, but it depends on the situation. Don't forget to account for the creative tools you have around shutter speed and how it impacts motion in your frame, whether it be the creative motion of water or just simply freezing elements that might be moving in your scene from the wind. Now, on the other side of the world, don't let yourself be out there accidentally shooting at ISO 3200 when you could be shooting at ISO 400 or ISO 100. You want to maximize the dynamic range. You want to reduce the amount of noise that you're getting in your images. So make sure to pay attention to it. So you do want to try to keep that ISO down low. Now, modern cameras, if you really have to kick it up for some situation, it's okay. I've shot at ISO 3200 for certain scenes and it works. Don't make it a habit. Pay attention to the ISO and bring it down when you need to. I can't count how many times I've been helping someone with their exposure and it's like, you're set to ISO 1600 and we're on a tripod and there's no wind. We can kick that way down and get it into a more appropriate setting. So make sure you're aware of your ISO and when you want it to be low and when you might want to bump it up a little bit in order to take advantage of adjusting something else in the exposure triangle to get the photo you want. So those are 3 mistakes I often see in the field that I think contribute to people not feeling comfortable getting the picture they want technically while out in the field. Hopefully this video has helped you identify maybe something that's causing you to not have confidence you should have and be able to build upon that and learn more about these things in order to be more confident and capture those images. Once you've learned the technicals of capturing a good image, a well-exposed image, an in-focus image, and all of those things, it really frees up your mind to go focus on that creativity. And that's why I push on the technical fundamentals so much. The technical fundamentals are all learnable. You can learn them. They're relatively concrete. There's always exceptions on, oh, it depends. You should do this here or there. But for the most part, once you get those foundations, it just frees you up so you can focus in on those compositions, learning to find interesting scenes, and just generally having a better time out there because you're not always nervous about, am I setting my camera up right to capture a good image? It sets you up for success in the results when you get back home and put it into your photography editor. Now, I've done videos on several of these topics before and more in depth, and I will link to those down in the description below. So if you're curious to learn more about the histogram, you want to learn more about depth of field and aperture, or if you want to learn more about ISO, I'm putting links to those videos down in the description below. And I highly recommend watching those because it'll dive much more deep into those and help you really understand those fundamentals so you can make it second nature for you. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to see future landscape photography videos from me, including tips, tricks, behind the scenes, and mini gear reviews, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And thank you for watching.